Well, I was here last year and I had so much fun, and it was so taken with Chautauqua that I somehow had to get myself back here. And so it's been a wonderful week for my wife, Kathy, and me. You know, I spent a number of years writing the book on John Lewis, which I talked about last year, and the subtitle's In Search of the Beloved Community. And I have to say, you know, that's kind of an ideal utopian entity, but I think Chautauqua is as close to as any place I've ever been or seen to the beloved community. It's really, you all should be very proud of being associated with the institution. It's just extraordinary. As I said last year, it's like the greatest graduate seminar ever, and it just goes on forever, you know. It's exhausting, I know, but it's quite wonderful. So today, you can see I've got my U.S. Open hat on, which I got in 2018, which after 9 years, I was able to finish the Arthur Ashe biography. It's what we call in Florida a roach killer. You can drop it, and it'll kill any roach in Florida, you know. But I really didn't think it was going to take me 9 years to do it. I thought I knew a lot about Arthur Ashe when I was starting, but I found out how little I knew, actually, in terms of the detail. And I got so absorbed in it. I think somehow I thought it would improve my backhand if I wrote this book about Arthur Ashe. It did not work, but as my doubles partners can attest. But you know, he's an endlessly fascinating character. You know, unique is an overused word, but there really has never been anyone like him. Sort of like Marian Anderson, actually, and John Lewis, that these people will come along maybe once in a century. And I know probably all of you know about his tennis exploits. Of course, on July 5th, 1975, 50 years ago, and I can remember watching the matches. I can't believe it's been 50 years, but you know, we're now 50 years out, and in fact, tomorrow would have been Arthur's 82nd birthday. So he'd still be among us, you know. Sadly, he died at 49, just like Alexander Hamilton. He never made it to 50. Probably, in some senses, it was very sad that he died of AIDS at 49. A huge mourning process for so many people. But can you imagine how long this book would have been if he kept living? You know, I mean, 600 pages on 49 years. If he'd lived to be 82, I don't know if anybody could have captured it. But what I want to do this morning, in the time we have, is talk a bit about Arthur generally, give you a sense of who he was, and then talk about his relationship to apartheid in South Africa, in the campaign against apartheid, which took place really just before the Wimbledon of 1975. So that it's an important part of the context. He spent years trying to get a visa to get into South Africa. It took him almost 6 years for them to give him a visa. And when he got there to play in the South African Open, he desperately wanted to win that tournament, you know, kind of to show the black people of South Africa that a black man could be successful in an athletic competition against a white man. But in the finals, he faced Jimmy Connors. And he'd never beaten Jimmy Connors, and he lost to Jimmy Connors that day. But of course, 2 years later, he beat Jimmy Connors at Wimbledon. That's part of the story I want to tell you. So it's all supercharged with all kinds of side lights and stories within stories. But let me talk a bit about Arthur. Who was he? You know, he was a black kid from Jackson Ward, part of Richmond, one of the poorest parts of the city. The same region where Bill Bojangle Robinson grew up, you know, probably the other famous Richmond person. who danced with Shirley Temple in those movies and gave his name to a chicken franchise, I guess now. I think Bojangles is still going. It really wasn't a slum, but it was all black and all working class poor. The Virginia Union, which was a historically black college, was on the hill, sort of above the neighborhood, but Arthur, his father was kind of a jack of all trades to support his family. He was illiterate, and but he was a chauffeur for some of the big Jewish families in the department store owners, and he did all kinds of things. He could do just about anything. But in 1947, when Arthur was 4, he got a job with the city as the kind of security guard and manager of the largest black park, Brookfield Park in Richmond. It's no longer there, sadly. It's now a U.S. post office. They basically just leveled the whole neighborhood and put in a post office. So Arthur basically grew up in this park. They gave his father the right to build a house out of scrap lumber, and so they built it. You probably know where this is going. About 50 yards from 4 tennis courts, okay? And nobody else lived there, so they were kind of isolated. There were other family, kin around, but when Arthur was 6, and this is a really important part of his whole life, he was very close to his mother. His father was kind of stern, disciplinarian, a bit unyielding, at least in those early years. But Arthur's mother was just, by all indications, this extraordinarily warm, wonderful, and educated woman. Unlike her husband, she dies when Arthur is 6. And it's just devastating. It was Arthur and his younger brother, Johnny, and he was so devastated that I've talked to some of his relatives, and they said for maybe 6 or 8 weeks, he didn't even talk. He just absolutely withdrew within himself. He was so depressed because he depended so much emotionally on his mother. And he would just sit on the porch. Well, near the porch, of course, were these tennis courts. And he was just a forlorn little boy. He also was very sickly when he was young. Hard to imagine this man was going to be a world-class athlete, one of the greatest tennis players of all time. He had legs and arms like pipe stems. I mean, he was just like a death camp survivor, really. He was always sick. And after his mother died, he would just sit on the porch and really wouldn't talk to anybody. And there was a man who played tennis for Virginia Union. He was their best player. He was 19 years old. Of all things, his name was Ron Charity. Isn't that great? Ron Charity. And he saw this poor little boy, and he tried to draw him out just to hit a couple tennis balls. Felt so sorry for him. And it took a while. Arthur would, no. He just was too scared. Finally, he got him out on the tennis court. And he could barely hit the ball over the net at that point, when he's 6. But he loved tennis, and it just sort of took with him. Nobody in his family had ever played tennis before, So by the time he's 8, he's beating every other little kid in Richmond, all the black kids who played against each other. Actually won his first tournament when he was 8. And in fact, one of his cousins said, well, let's go over to the White Park, Bird Park, where blacks couldn't play, and see if we can get in this tournament. Because he thought, Arthur, you can beat anybody your age. And Sam Woods, who was really quite a nice man and not a real hyper white supremacist or anything, said, I'm so sorry, Arthur, I just can't do it. They'll fire me if I let you play tennis here. And so they went away. They tried. And that's an interesting story because everybody who plays tennis in Richmond plays at Bird Park, okay? And years later, when Arthur became world famous and he's playing at the French Open and he's playing at Wimbledon, people from Richmond would come up to him, at least several times he said, they'd say, Arthur, we are so proud of you. We are so proud of you. I remember watching you play at Byrd Park. And took a lot to get Arthur Ashe mad. You know, he was absolutely the coolest, even-keeled person you can imagine. But that stuck in his craw. And of course, he informed them, you know, I never played at Byrd Park. And however, as he reveals in his autobiography, Days of Grace, which is a wonderful book that he wrote just before he died of AIDS, it was a big bestseller. He said, however, I lost my virginity in the parking lot at Byrd Park. Now, yeah, don't get mad, get even, right? and so, anyway, he became extraordinarily kind of precocious in tennis. He was thin always. I mean, even at the end of his life, he was 6'1", 155 pounds. But he at least got taller, and he just had this incredible knack. In fact, Doug Weiler, of course, who became the black governor of Virginia, lived in the neighborhood. He was about 5 years older than Arthur, and he played tennis. He was a very enthusiastic tennis player. But Arthur was always monopolizing. They had a backboard where you could hit balls against, and Arthur would be there all day. And the bigger kids had to throw him off, you know. He was like, oh, past. And Wilder told me, he said, I mean, I love Arthur, but he hogged the backboard, okay? So anyway, he went on to be really an extraordinarily talented player. Some of you may have heard of Dr. Johnson. He was also called Dr. J. He was a medical doctor in Lynchburg who had a summer tennis camp for African Americans. And he had 2 tennis courts on his backyard, and he'd bring everybody out. He's the man who discovered Althea Gibson. He was responsible for Althea Gibson, of course, being the first black woman to play in the majors in major tournaments against whites. And of course, she won everything eventually, and extraordinary figure. I sometimes say that Arthur Ashe was the Jackie Robinson of tennis, but my wife always corrects me. Althea Gibson was the Jackie Robinson of tennis. She came first, and and finally they've recognized that. You know, at the U.S. Open at the National Tennis Center, there's now a statue of Althea. I can remember when I was there, actually, I think it was 2013, I was talking to some of the black players, and we were talking, kind of conspiring about how can we get her recognized, because there was nothing. You know, she had this extraordinary life, and so now it's there. It's great. It was interesting when we were talking about it. We wondered, what kind of statue will they put up? Because if you've been to the U.S. Open, to the National Tennis Center, of course, the largest tennis stadium in the world is named for Arthur Ashe, right? And so everybody at least knows the name, even if they don't know anything about him because of Ashe Stadium. But there's also an extraordinary sculpture. I don't know how many of you have seen it, of Arthur. He's kind of extended. It's a nude, anatomically correct nude of Arthur Ashe, like supposedly hitting a tennis ball, you know. And I think he probably would have been mortified if he'd been alive to see this. It's a beautiful sculpture, I must say, but. And reveals a lot about Arthur Ashe, I'll say that. Probably more than my book, you know. But anyway, you know, he had a kind of love-hate relationship with Richmond. They would never, his name never appeared in the paper. He was one of the best junior players in the country. Nobody in Richmond knew who he was, not in the white community anyway. In fact, I met a couple, maybe they're here. They're from Wheeling, West Virginia. Well, there was a junior tournament when Arthur was 15 in Wheeling, and the other really great young player in Richmond was Tom Tuning. He was white, and he looks at this draw sheet in this tournament, and he sees this name, Arthur Ashe, Richmond, Virginia. And he thought it was a joke. Bill Reardon, who was later Jimmy Connor's manager, I'll mention him again later, he liked to put in these sort of joke names in the draw. He ran the tournaments. And so Tom said, oh, what kind of name is that? And so Reardon says, he's right there. Only black person there, of course. And so they had to go to Wheeling, West Virginia, to meet. And they became best friends, lifelong friends. And Tom Tuning was really one of the people, major people responsible for putting the Arthur Ashe statue on Monument Avenue. You've probably heard about that famous statue and the controversy it raised in 1996. And I interviewed Tom extensively for the book, and he was teary-eyed the whole time he was talking to me because he loved Arthur so much. I kept running into that. I'd go to the U.S. Open every year to interview people who knew Arthur, and oh my! One of the first interviews was with Cliff Drysdale. You probably know him as an announcer. Well, he's a famous South African player, anti-apartheid, close friend of Arthur's. They helped to create the Association of Tennis Professionals, ATP, in 1972. So I haven't asked a question yet. I'd never met Cliff Drysdale before. And we're sitting in the Waldorf Astoria lobby. It's this regal place, and he starts crying uncontrollably. And he finally got his composure, and he said, I'm so sorry, this always happens to me when someone asks me to talk about Arthur. In fact, he'd been asked the day before by ESPN to do an on-camera interview, and he said, I turned him down because I'm just a mess when I start thinking and talking about Arthur. And he told me, he said, he was the greatest person I knew in my lifetime. I only wish I could have been more like him, and he's, I got some good quotes from him in the interview, but it just gave me a sense, and this happened more than once. People felt so, and these are even people who knew him when he was young, and he wasn't supposedly a great player yet or a great person. And they saw him develop into this extraordinary advocate of human rights and of every conceivable social justice issue. But it came late for Arthur. The first 24 years of his life, he went on to play at UCLA. He won the NCAA championship in 1965, and he was, the number 1 or 2 player in the country. But he wasn't involved in civil rights those early years. He was kind of naturally shy, and he really thought he couldn't afford to be controversial. He was the only black player. Think about if Jackie Robinson came into Major League Baseball, but Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and Frank Robinson and all those didn't. Arthur was all by himself for virtually his entire career. So he had to deal with that. So for those early years, he thought, I'll just be a good role model. That's what I'll do for my race. That's what I'll do for justice. I'm not the kind of person who can picket or do sit-ins or anything like that. And of course, he had, at the summer camp out in Lynchburg with Dr. J, he really instilled this kind of discipline in these young black kids that, look, we got to fight our way into these tournaments. So we can't afford any racial incidents. So if you're playing a white boy and the white boy hits the ball and is just out, you call it in. They would call their own lines. And so Arthur sort of followed that, even into his pro years. You may have seen there are all kinds of incidents where he would give away points. He was just the most gracious, the best sport you can ever imagine, really. But in the early years, he felt that he just had to keep his nose to the grindstone, really. And of course, his father was pushing him that way as well. Boy, don't get involved with that civil rights mess, is the way his father put it. But there was another figure in his life, Jefferson Rogers, who was a minister at the Church of the Redeemer in Washington, D.C., a friend of Dr. King's, big, kind of a mountain of a man, force. I interviewed it, I got to know him, and he kind of just, you sort of cower in his sight. He's just extraordinary. If he tells you to do something, you sort of want to do it, you know. And but he was sort of a countervailing force to Arthur's father. He said, Arthur, you know, you're becoming famous. You've got to use that fame for good. You can't just be a tennis player, you know. And so finally, Arthur was actually in the Army for 2.5 years. When he won the first U.S. Open in 1968, he was on leave from the Army. He was stationed at West Point. He was coaching the junior varsity tennis team and doing data processing there, you know. Jefferson Rogers has these weekly kind of full public forum, and he'd invite people to speak at the church about social issues or whatever they want to talk about. And so Arthur finally agrees, after a lot of sawing, that he would speak in March of 1968. And he had seen a lot of the kind of the carnage of the Vietnam War, being at West Point, all the notices of the bodies coming in and the body counts and everything. And he'd become very much against the war, even though he was in uniform and at West Point. So he agreed to speak. He gets down to Washington to the Church of the Redeemer, and who's the first person he meets going in the door? Stokely Carmichael, okay? The SNCC leader, you know, radical extraordinaire. And so Stokely's there when he gives his talk. And he talked about the social responsibility of black athletes. That's what Arthur talked about. And he really spoke from the heart. He'd never done a public speech in his life. And of course, this is just a couple of weeks before Dr. King is assassinated. He had some correspondence with Dr. King, really had idolized him. And then he met Bobby Kennedy and did a bit in his campaign. And of course, then he's assassinated in early June. And something snapped in Arthur with those two assassinations and giving that speech. Of course, the Army was very upset with him. They said, none of that, no more of that stuff when you're in uniform. And, but he just made a decision he was going to devote the rest of his life, really, to making the world a better place. That he'd done just about everything he'd wanted to do in the tennis world. You know, he was actually even beginning to make some money. He was an amateur still, but when he won the U.S. Open in 1968, he beat Tom Ocker, the Dutch player, in the finals. But Tom was a pro; he got the money. It was $14,000 in those days. You can imagine; it's over $1 million now. Fortunately, Arthur never had any money whatsoever, and an anonymous donor, nobody to this day knows who it is, gave him something like 100 shares of General Motors. And finally they decided that that would not disturb his amateur status, that he could take the shares of stock, and gave him a little bit of breathing room, you know, in terms of his financial situation. He turned pro in 1969. And almost immediately became one of the central figures in bringing about open tennis and in the professionalization of men's tennis. The ATP was founded in 1972. Arthur became president in 1974. Cliff Drysdale was the first president, so they were very close. And this is part of the story of Wimbledon, because Arthur, as the head of the ATP, was sort of responsible for trying to really increase the morale and the organization of professional tennis. It really hadn't really come together yet, you know. And he was also recruiting people for Davis Cup. And the one person who would not play, because in those days you didn't get any money for playing Davis Cup. So it took, you know, several months out of the year if you played Davis Cup, and you really were sacrificing. And Jimmy Connors wouldn't do it. Now, he's the best player in the world at that point, and he was a loner. He didn't join the ATP. He created his own tennis circuit. You know, he was a brat, basically, self-interested, a great player, probably the only person, Jeannie Ashe told me, that Arthur just didn't like. He tried. They were like oil and water. And so in the weeks before the 1975 Wimbledon, Arthur made a statement in a letter as the president of the ATP that Jimmy Connors was selfish, unpatriotic, didn't really regard the interests of the other players, and so Bill Reardon, the same guy who fooled around with the draw in the wheeling tournament, who's now Jimmy Connors' manager, he convinces Jimmy to file a $3 million lawsuit against Arthur for defamation of character. And at the same time, another $2 million against the ATP. So this is all hanging over, the Wimbledon of 1975, which we're now commemorating the 50th anniversary. And, hard to imagine what Arthur could have been thinking, I mean, he's 31 years old now. It's sort of his last chance to win Wimbledon. He dreamed about it his whole life, and nobody gave him a chance. That was the first year that bookies were allowed on the grounds at Wimbledon. And the odds were 20-1 for Connors. And, but interestingly enough, now Reardon is Connors' manager, right? And Connors injured his leg in a tournament just before. We don't even know how bad it was, but he certainly could play. But Reardon later came, well, that's why Ashe won, but nobody else, I think, believes that. But anyway, but Reardon was worried, and so just before they played the finals of Wimbledon, Reardon went and placed a huge bet on Arthur. Isn't that something? So he made a lot of money out of the fact that his player lost. He was quite a cagey character, a man for our times, right? Anyway, Arthur later claimed he knew he was going to win. He'd never beaten Connors. Connors had won the year before. In the semifinals, he played Arthur's friend and doubles partner. I'm blanking on the name right now. Fastest serve in the world from Tennessee. Anybody remember? Who? Roscoe Tanner, yes. Who later served a term in prison. How are we doing on time, Olivia?
We've got like 5 minutes.
Okay, great. So he just destroyed Roscoe Tanner, even though he had the fastest serve in the world. So I think Arthur was a bit nervous. But the night before the final match, he got all of his friends together, Donald Dell, his manager, and Marty Reeson, some really good players, and they had a kind of like a seminar on how he could possibly beat Jimmy Connors. And they decided that he couldn't give Connors any pace, because the faster he hit it, the faster Connors would hit it back. So they devised this chip and lob strategy, playing more like the players did in the 1930s, really. Now, wasn't Arthur's game. He had one of the fastest serves in the world, incredibly powerful backhand. He wasn't a chipper or a lobber, but they said, you got to make Connors hit up. So hit short balls and make him drive him wide, and it worked. I mean, it was incredible. People couldn't believe their eyes. He won the first 2 sets, 6-1, 6-1. Okay. And Connors was mumbling to himself on the sidelines, what is going on here? He came back and won the 3rd set, 7-5. And Arthur won the 4th, 6-4. And I don't think certainly the greatest upset in Wimbledon history, without question, And afterwards, Arthur was such a gracious winner. He always would praise his opponent and try to take some of the sting out of the defeat for them. Not that day, okay? So he's walking off the court, and he looks up at Donald Dell and his buddies in the box, and he gives a fist like this, okay? And he claimed later it was just a kind of symbol, we did it, But of course, it was misinterpreted as a Black Power salute, that it was much like what John Carlos and Tommy Smith had done at the '68 Olympics in Mexico City. But Arthur was not a Black Power person. He was very proud of being African American and was very dedicated to reform and civil rights. But the Black Power kind of slogan made him nervous. He didn't really like to mix emotion and politics. He's very kind of rational. He was an intellectual. I mean, he was a voracious reader, collected first editions, always had his head in a book. When I went through his papers, all this correspondence with philosophers and historians, people all over the world, and I love the images. There were times when Jimmy Connors would come in to the locker room, and Arthur would be there doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, which he would do every day, compulsively, or he'd be reading a book, and Connors would just shake his head, super nerd kind of guy. But Arthur was really committed to kind of discourse. He was a very good listener. He had very strong opinions, but he wanted to give everybody their say. He was really a true devotee of the First Amendment, and he really put his money where his mouth was, really. It was extraordinary what he did over the next few years. He set up programs, the youth tennis, 1969, which spread all over the country. It changed the lives of thousands of young, mostly Black players, and gave so much money to foundations. He would never say no. There are all these wonderful stories when he would be doing a clinic, free clinic. He never charged, even for expenses. He'd be anywhere that they wanted him. I had his logbooks, his daily logbooks. You cannot believe that any human being could do that much in one day, And he'd be in like 3 different cities in a day. He'd be in Washington. He'd fly to Chicago. He'd fly to Los Angeles, for these clinics. And they always had to drag him off because he really loved kids. And he and Jeannie, it turned out, could not have children. So about 10 years after they were married, they adopted a little girl, Camera. Jeannie was a photographer, so they named her Camera. But he just was so attentive to these young children. And he just wouldn't stop. It'd be getting dark, and he'd still be talking to them, still, encouraging them, and just an extraordinarily generous human being, And a lot of that generosity for a number of years was expressed towards South Africa. I want to talk about that a little bit. Some of his friends speculate that Black politics in the United States was so turbulent, and everybody wanted a piece of him. They wanted him to express their ideas, whatever it was, Black Power, whatever. And he sort of globalized himself in a sense, turned to South Africa, anti-apartheid, as his cause. I think in some ways it was easier for him. He didn't have to negotiate all through the domestic Black politics. So in 1968, he's having a conversation with Cliff Drysdale, South African, and they're talking about South Africa was going to have its first open tournament. And a lot of people were going to go play. And Cliff turns to Arthur and says, "Well, you can't go." And Arthur goes, "What? Why can't I go?" He was sort of naive about this. He said, "Well, no, they'd never give you a visa. They'd never let you into South Africa. The tennis authorities would love to have you, but the government will never let you in." So right there, he decided, well, I'm going to show you're wrong. So he spent the next 5 years trying to get a visa and went through all kinds of machinations. He also had to sort of answer to the dominant wing of the anti-apartheid movement in the United States, because most of them were all about closing South Africa off, isolating them, throwing them out of the Davis Cup, throwing them out of international organizations, hitting them where they lived, because the South African whites were crazy about sports. Arthur was the exception. He believed in constructive engagement. He thought if we can just show these people that blacks and whites can be together and the sky won't fall, So he He later changed his mind, by the way. He really decided, it didn't work. But he, at that point, he was determined to sort of penetrate the apartheid regime. And so he made some rather incendiary statements which were sort of out of character for him. At one point, he got carried away and he thought, we probably should just drop a bomb on Johannesburg, And the South Africans, whites, really, okay, well, this guy is really crazy radical. We'll never let him in the country. But that was just a momentary thing, maybe not to the white South Africans. But anyway, finally in 1973, through the offices of Owen Williams, who was a very fine amateur player in South Africa, white player, and was a kind of a tournament promoter. He had close ties to the South African government. And he basically negotiated that Arthur could come and play in the South African Open. Now, at one point, they tried to change his visa that he was an honorary white. Okay. This was often done. They did this for boxers who would box in South Africa. They'd be very dark-skinned. They'd be an honorary white. And Arthur was very insulted by that. He thought that's just ridiculous. But he did finally get in, and it was really an amazing thing. It caused a stir all over the country, particularly in Soweto and in the black townships. And there's just incredible stories of, there's one man named Mark Mathabene. Maybe you've read his book, Kaffir Boy. It was a big bestseller. Mark was a 14-year-old kid at the time, a kind of aspiring tennis player, and he heard the incredible news. It was like a spaceship coming down, that a white man was going to play a black man in this tournament. And he said, this can't be. So he hitchhiked over 200 miles to get to Johannesburg to see Arthur play. And later, Arthur and Stan Smith were instrumental in getting him to come to the United States. And he had a very successful career as a writer. He was a teacher in Oregon, a prep school in Portland. And I interviewed him a couple of times. Just this wonderful man. But hard to imagine this little 14-year-old boy who basically defied his family. So they didn't know he was gone. He just said, I'm going to see Arthur Ashe, And there were a lot of stories like that. He went to Soweto, and all these black children, I've got a picture of this in the book, all these black children gathered around him like they were seeing a god or something. And a black minister came up and said, you are Sifo, which was the word, that's what they always called him after that, which means the gift in Xhosa language. And, he saw parts of South Africa that probably no black American had ever seen. And he went all over the country. And the white South Africans couldn't wait to get rid of him, of course. But that was just the first of many visits. He set up foundations, just went back year after year, became his passion, really. And for the rest of his life, he was one of the leading anti-apartheid advocates in the United States. But he took a lot of grief for it because there were a lot of people who said, they're using you. If you play in South Africa against whites, they'll say, well, we're not so racist. We're not so bad. Arthur Ashe played here, right? So he had to put up with a lot of criticism. But he was really a truth teller. I think he had such a sense of himself, a kind of inner confidence. Although I talk a lot in the book about the two Arthur Ashes. Outside he was Mr. Cool, particularly after he got sort of fashion in the late 60s. He started wearing dashikis. I wore this shirt as kind of a Arthur Ashe shirt. I was once at the Open, and one of his friends came up and said, you've got an Arthur Ashe shirt on, this shirt. And I said, well, thank you. But grew his hair into an afro. Still incredibly polite, nice to everyone. But inside, I think there was turmoil. And I think that may have been one of the things that shortened his life, frankly. He had a lot of heart trouble in his family. His mother died, 6 of heart conditions related to a pregnancy. His father died of heart disease. But he was shocked. He's a world-class athlete. He's thin, powerful. He really took care of himself in terms of eating right and exercising, of course. And when he had the heart attack in 1979, he couldn't believe it. But he made it through that first heart attack, and he had bypass surgery. But it started coming back. He took a trip to Egypt. He was in the desert next to the pyramids, and he had this massive seizure. And he recovered from that. But in 1983, his heart was in terrible shape. So he had a quadruple bypass, still thinking he could come back and play professional tennis. Isn't that amazing? He still was determined that he'd get back on the court. And that's when he got the bad blood. He was in a hospital in Harlem. He had very fine surgeons. That was before we even had blood tests. They aren't even invented until 1984. So you couldn't be tested, for HIV until then. And he didn't know about it until 1988. So he was living with this for 5 years without knowing anything. He thought he'd been cured. But he got a condition in 1988 called toxoplasmosis, which often HIV and AIDS victims get that. One of his arms started to kind of be paralyzed, and they opened him up, and sure enough, the blood test showed that he had AIDS. But in those days, there was so much misinformation. I talked to people who knew him who, their first feeling was, well, of course he must be gay. I think I can tell you authoritatively he was not gay. He was one of the most eligible bachelors in the world. Dated Beverly Johnson, the first black woman on the cover of Vogue. Swedish flight attendants, you name it, incredible list of women. And he was always I talked to some of them, and he was like a 16-year-old. He was so polite and mannered. He'd open the door for them and all this sort of thing. And finally he met Jeannie and married her in 1976. 77, I guess, was the marriage. 5 minutes? 2 minutes? Okay. Well, if you want to know more, you got to read the book, okay? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So let me remind everyone, if you have questions, to please send your questions to questions@chq.org, or have your hand up for the monitors to give you a pencil and a paper. And with that, let me do a quick reminder that if you've enjoyed this particular lecture, that the Chautauqua dialogues for this specific lecture will only be at the AAHH at 40 Scott tomorrow, Thursday, 4 o'clock. So if you want to have a conversation about this lecture, let's see you there. Here's a question. What do you think Arthur Ashe would think of some of the what we consider renowned athletes today, and based on balancing that sense of social issues, politics, and the kind of money that athletes are being paid?
Well, he'd certainly be shocked by the money, but I think he'd be very proud. It's become a much more common tradition for athletes to speak out. Think of LeBron James. Many of the top athletes are now willing to take risks. Maybe it's because they do make so much money they can afford to take the risks. But, I mean, there's so many examples of, I mean, think about in the NFL taking the knee, how many people supported that. And I think he'd be very encouraged that, you know, the efforts towards, you know, bringing African Americans and other minorities, not just onto the playing field or the court, but in the front office. You know, many coaches now, that was unthinkable. I mean, he was the, you know, Bill Russell was the first black coach in the NBA. Frank Robinson was the first black manager. Arthur was the first head of the Davis Cup, which is essentially equivalent, you know. So, and he knew that it was very controversial, you know, that he had to work twice as hard as anyone else to keep his position. So I think he'd be very encouraged, very, really. And of course, he'd be stunned by the success of the Williams sisters and Coco Gauff and you know, James Blake and just many, many other really fine African-American tennis players. He always said that could happen if they just given a chance, you know, to get the training that white kids got in country clubs.
What happened in the lawsuit?
Oh, I left you hanging, didn't I? William Reardon and Jimmy Connors had a falling out just after Wimbledon. And basically Connors fired him as his manager, and he very quietly dropped the lawsuit. In fact, Arthur said publicly that he never really blamed Jimmy Connors for the lawsuit. He thought it was always Reardon. Now they did the lawsuit against the ATP. The Reardon and Connors actually won. They got $2 million for that one. But the one against Arthur was dropped. And later, you know, when Arthur was the captain of the Davis Cup, Jimmy Connors played for him in one of the years, and you know, they tried to cement a kind of friendship. They played golf a couple times. I think Arthur said Jimmy cheated, but so even that relationship, which was so difficult, he tried to make the best of it, which was really his style.
Oh, okay. Don't quite get both of the parts of this, but you can answer part of it. What do you think that Ashe would have said about the state of Richmond? And then there's something about the last one standing. Whose question? Statue.
Oh, the statue, yes.
Okay.
Well, that's a great story. I don't know how many of you have been to Richmond, but the great boulevard is Monument Avenue. And until recently, it was lined with Confederate generals, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, these massive granite statues. And after Arthur, well, actually even before he died, he was helping to create an African-American Sports Hall of Fame in Richmond. And they hired this wonderful sculptor, Paul Di Pasquale, to do a statue of Arthur. After Arthur died, there was a big movement to move that statue, when it was done, to Monument Avenue. And it was very controversial. The Klan burned a few crosses, threats, bomb threats, all kinds of things. Paul Di Pasquale, his life was threatened, he told me. But eventually, they were able to get it through the city council, and despite all the controversy, they put the statue up in 1996. And Jeannie Ashe didn't want it there. There was so much trouble, she said, they don't deserve Arthur's statue. Let's put it in the black community. We don't want to be there. But she was overruled, in part by Doug Wilder, who was governor, a friend of Arthur's. He really led the way, so he should be there. This will signify the new Richmond, if we could get his statue there. And of course today, as you probably know, all the granite statues are gone. And the only statue left is Arthur's statue. And I've been there on a number of occasions, and there are almost always European or non-American tourists there having pictures taken, and it's just a wonderful thing, really. And in fact, one of the people who got this pass through the city council was that Tom Tuning, that white player who became his friend, who basically got up. He's a very successful businessman. He played #1 at Chapel Hill in college. He shamed the city council into doing it. He said, you know, how can you imagine not doing this? Arthur's probably the greatest person who ever came out of Richmond, you know, and you should be so proud of that, and you should, and he was able to carry the day. It was really quite remarkable. So the statue, there's actually talk now, though, I talked to somebody here who was saying, well, it looks kind of strange just having the one statue, you know. And of course, President Trump has talked about trying to put these statues back. I don't think it will happen. I don't want to say over my dead body, but some people's dead bodies anyway. But it's if you do go to Richmond, it just takes my breath away, really. And Paul DiPasquale was so brave in doing it because he took incredible grief in doing that statue. But Arthur had a part in it. For some reason, he didn't want it to be a heroic statue. He wanted just his figure. He wanted to be surrounded by children with books, and that's the statue. And for some reason, he wanted his tennis sneakers, the shoelaces, untied. And Paul told me, never figured out why he wanted them untied, but I did what he said. You can't see them because they're over a little rise, a wall, but it's very touching. It really is.
Okay. Where do you find hope in America around reconciliation among African Americans and colonial whites?
Well, I see a tremendous amount of resistance to what's happening. I know in my community in St. Petersburg, there's just a huge mobilization of people, many of whom have never been involved in politics before, who've never marched, who've never, donated, who are just so shocked and outraged at what's happening across the country. So I think John Lewis had a sense of that just before he died. When the Black Lives Matter movement, which has now been demonized, of course, but then John said he'd waited all his life for that level of mobilization, millions of people marching for social justice. And the last thing he did before he went into the hospital and died of pancreatic cancer is he got up enough energy to walk to the Black Lives Matter plaza north of the White House. And I've got a picture of that in the Lewis book. It's just so amazing, touching image. But I keep remembering John Lewis about hope and never giving up and getting into good trouble, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people are getting into good trouble. Maybe we haven't shown much for it yet, but I guess for the sake of my children and grandchildren, I just can't. I don't want to fall into despair. It's not easy. Sometimes you have to turn the news off and watch Animal Planet, things like that. But so I think.
We're going to take two more, and then we'll have to get over to the bookstore. Ashe wrote 4 autobiographies. How do you treat those as a professional historian?
Treat what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
His autobiographies. He wrote 4, according to this.
Oh, yeah. I don't think I could have written the book without them. He was very candid. He really was a truth teller. And it's at 4 different stages of his life. So I couldn't interview him. He died before I started this project. But in a sense, I could, because he wrote, of course, the final book is the best, Days of Grace, but he wrote Advantage Ashe and when he was very young, and he didn't edit himself. You know, I mean, he had people helping him, but he was a pretty good writer himself, for sure. And although he was always hurt, when he got to UCLA, he was the valedictorian of his high school. He was always the smartest kid around. And they told him he had to take remedial English. And he was just shocked. He said, "What do you mean?" But he got over it. But he really did me an incredible service. I don't think I could have done the book without. I mean, he just talked about everything. You know, he just didn't hold anything back. That's very rare, I think, in memoirs and autobiographies. And of course, I was able to interview virtually every one of his, certainly his tennis friends, but beyond that, family members, and they all were so eager to talk to me, to help me, because there had not been a biography at that point, and they really wanted. And I think some of them worried for a while after it got 7 years, 8 years. Is this book ever going to come out? Are you ever going to finish it? But they were wonderful to me after it came out.
Does anyone know how giving up points the way that he did impacted him psychologically or emotionally?
Giving a point away what? Sorry.
When he would give up points to competitors, how that might have impacted him psychologically or emotionally?
Well, he was often criticized for not having a killer instinct. He probably finished second more times than any other tennis player in history. I mean, he won 51 tournaments, and he won. You know, he won 5 majors, 2 doubles and 3 singles. You know, he won. So he was incredibly successful. But there were a lot of times when he was into the artistry of tennis. He would take chances that he probably shouldn't have taken if he just wanted to win. He didn't have a bottom line mentality. He wanted to do it gracefully, and he was probably the most graceful player of his generation. And people would tell him, "Arthur, just do it the easy way. You know, you don't have to always look beautiful when you're hitting a tennis ball. You know." And but he was really into the art of tennis. He loved it, I think, in a way that maybe other professional tennis players didn't love it. You know. That's why he spent all that time with the children, and why he wrote so many manuals on how to play. And he was really an intellectual of tennis, frankly. And so what he did to Connors in terms of that strategy, in some ways was typical. It wasn't his typical way he played, but the fact that he cerebrally, he's probably the smartest player in the modern era to play tennis. And what he didn't have in his body, he was not very big, 155 pounds, but he had the second fastest serve in the world. He was just so adaptable, but he didn't adapt necessarily just to win. He'd almost rather have a beautiful topspin backhand trying to hit an impossible shot and it's just out. He got more satisfaction out of that than just hitting it in. And he drove his friends crazy, with this but he was a little bit stubborn about it. But he loved the artistry of tennis. And
we're going to ready ourselves for those that have not gotten their book. They can get it over at the Octagon, and in honor of John Lewis. His memorial is coming up the day he died on July 17th. The AAHH will be holding a small thing on that date at our house at 5 o'clock, and around one of the things he was passionate about, which was voter rights and getting out votes for rural blacks and whites in Virginia and helping them get recognized and what they need and to be able to be registered. So be looking for that on our website, on Grapevine, and all over. And with that said, please come, if you have a book, over here, and let's give Ray Arsenault what he deserves.
Thank you. Thank you very much.